Thank you so much, Emma. And once again, just a reminder on how points of information work is you ask a question that's 10 to 15 seconds, and then you wait for the speaker, first of all, to accept your POI, and then if they do, you ask your question, and then you are silent while the speaker continues. It is not an invitation to continue a back and forth. It is an invitation to ask the question and then wait for the speaker to respond. So now moving back to our paper speakers and our final round of paper speakers in this debate. So closing the case for the proposition tonight is Dr. Sam Perlo-Freeman. Dr. Perlo-Freeman is an associate senior researcher at SIPRI. He was the head of the SIPRI project on military expenditure in the Arms Transfers and Military Expenditure Program. And he currently works with the World Peace Foundation, where he leads the Global Arms Trade and Corruption Project. Dr. Perlo-Freeman, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Thank you, Mr. President, outgoing. It's a real honour to speak here. I should give a point of information first, that this was former roles. My current role is as research coordinator at Campaign Against Arms Trade, a small NGO that does what it says on the label. But I did before work in those two places and still have connections to them. I want to talk a bit about some of the legal aspects of this, as we are talking about The Hague. First of all, I mean, there was a lot I disagreed with, as well as a few things I agreed with in Ambassador Bolton's speech, but there was one thing that spilt water, that really disturbed me, which was saying, when Ambassador Bolton said, sorry if I've got this not quite right, I'm sure that both sides in Russia and Ukraine are committing war crimes, but that's what happens in war. I mean, I don't think we should draw any equivalence between what war crimes, the systematic large-scale war crimes that Russia is committing, and any more retail war crimes that some Ukrainian soldiers or officers might be committing. But more importantly, this idea that war crimes are inevitable. Ambassador Bolton talked about going back to the 20s and 30s. It seems that he's inviting us to rewind back to a time in the 1920s before the Geneva Conventions were first signed. That after the horrors of World War I and then the even greater horrors of World War II, the world decided that even wars have rules, or should have rules. That even if you are fighting and killing, whether attacking or defending, that there should be limits on what you can do. No targeting of civilians, no executing of prisoners or targeting of those who are wounded. And no use of the most cruel and barbaric weapons. And, of course, these laws of war are they're observed more in the breach than in the following. And, of course, they are imperfectly enforced. But that without them, and without sometimes these laws being enforced, whether it's at The Hague or in national courts, even sometimes when countries will prosecute their own soldiers who have stepped over the lines, as has happened in Western countries. Without that, we are saying that anything goes in war, that once you have made the decision to go to war, that there is no atrocity that cannot be justified in fighting and winning that war, and I profoundly disagree with that. But what I want to come back to is this question of the whole motion, the British arms industry should be taken to The Hague, that no one's actually said what we mean by that so far. So by The Hague, we mean the International Criminal Court. The International Court of Justice deals with disputes between states. So South Africa's recent case was against Israel. You can't take an arms industry to the ICJ because they're not a state. So we mean the International Criminal Court established by the Rome Statute. Ambassador Bolton said that it has no power. That might come as news to the various individuals who are locked up in The Hague as a result of its verdicts. It doesn't have enough power. It depends on the cooperation of member states and obviously doesn't get it from the US or Russia or China. But it does have power, unlike the ICJ. And when we talk about the UK arms industry, well, the ICC has a mandate to prosecute individuals. You can't imprison an industry. We're talking about the top decision makers who make the decisions to export arms where they are being used to commit war crimes. And the crime that we are talking about is aiding and abetting war crimes. That is a very specific crime. I would say there is overwhelming evidence that war crimes were committed by the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. This has been said by UN expert reports, by Muatana for Human Rights, a very brave Yemeni organization that works on the ground, that though being in Sana'a, they are constantly criticizing the Houthis who rule Sana'a for their gross abuses, but who criticize and who hold to account all sides and all violations, and by other international NGOs like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. The Saudi coalition has bombed hospitals. That is a war crime. They have bombed civilian gatherings, funerals, marriages, perhaps sometimes because there was a Houthi commander going to it, so they killed over 100 civilians along with this Houthi commander at a wedding. That is a war crime. I could go on. And by selling arms with full knowledge, so planes, not just the planes themselves, BAE has over 6,000 employees on the ground in Saudi Arabia maintaining the Air Force, without which, and similar help from the US, they could have not kept flying, they could have not kept bombing. So with full knowledge that these war crimes are being committed using the very planes and bombs that these companies are supplying, that is the crime that we are talking about, that not an abstract industry, not a production line would be taken to The Hague, but specific individuals who are ultimately responsible for these decisions. Yes? Mm. Mm. I think that ultimately, all who have committed war crimes, or where there's a case they've committed war crimes, should be prosecuted. Very often that's not possible. Saudi is not going to prosecute Saudi, and the Houthis are not going to prosecute the Houthis. Maybe a time will come when there'll be a different government in Yemen that can bring some of the Houthi leaders to justice. I hope so. But the ICC, it doesn't have jurisdiction over Saudi because they're not a state party, or over Yemen because they're not a state party. It does have jurisdiction over the UK and over decisions made in the UK, whether by government officials or armed corporate executives to export arms. That is a thing that they do have the power to do. Sadly, they don't have the power to hold Mohammed bin Salman to account. But they can do, there is some things they can do. Now, I heard from both Ambassador Bolton and from Julia, and congratulations on, I guess this must be your first speech for something like this, on a very good job done, that we can't take the industry to The Hague because we need arms. Well, I think Ukraine does need arms at the moment, and actually, although generally we're against, as it says on the label, arms sales, I think that the donation of arms to Ukraine is necessary and justified. But to say, because we need arms, the UK, because Ukraine needs arms, then those who produce arms cannot ever be held to account for the harm that those arms cause, that is an absurd logic to me. It is like saying, we need the police. A lot of people would agree, some people would disagree. We need the police, therefore no police officer should ever be prosecuted for harms, unjustified harms they do. We need the police, so Derek Chauvin should never have been prosecuted for murdering George Floyd. That is a flawed logic. The truth is, if individual decision makers, both government officials, ministers, and corporate executives, were taken to The Hague, were prosecuted, were, if found guilty, imprisoned, the arms industry wouldn't end, the Army and Navy and Air Force would not be dissolved, but those in charge of the decisions would know that in the future they could be held to account for what they do. Thank you very much.